for. So the last announcement I want to sort of bundle into my remarks about this week's Torah portion, and so that's where I'm going to begin. As I mentioned up in front of the Ark this week, we find ourselves in Parshat Bishalach, which contains, as I mentioned, the Torah's account of the parting of the Red Sea as the Israelite slaves escape from Egypt on their way to freedom. This is one of the most familiar scenes from the Bible, even from people who are not themselves religious or biblically literate. This is one of the most familiar images that we can conjure up from the Bible, from theater, from art, from film. The scene gives us one of the most dramatic examples in the entire Bible of God's power and sovereignty, and it may represent the most important climax of our people's life in antiquity. Remember what you know about that scene, the Israelites fleeing from slavery, finding themselves standing before the expanse of the Red Sea, weeping and wailing. And as they stand there, they look to God, and God says, Sam knows this line, God says, "Why do you cry out to me?" God says. It is a devastating line for God to reply to these fleeing slaves. And at the same time, it's kind of darkly comic, too. Remember, this moment comes after all of the 10 plagues, after the most devastating and dramatic signs and wonders that God has wrought throughout the land of Pharaoh. This has come after the miraculous redemption from a heartless tyrant who, after months of refusal, has at last agreed to let the people go. And so, following God's commands, the Israelites pack up their belongings and escape under cover of night. And they arrive at last at the seashore. And the soldiers and the chariots are hot on their trail. They arrive right there at the water's edge. Moses turns his eyes to heaven for redemption and rescue, and God says, "What are you looking at me for?" It's comedy, but it's not only comedy. And God's reply isn't meant to be a dismissal of Moses or a disparagement of the Israelites' faith in God's power to save them. And the way that we know this is because that line doesn't end there. The verse continues, "Why do you cry out to me? Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'yisa'u." Tell the Israelites to go forward. The point isn't that God is shirking responsibility. The point is that God wants to make sure that Moses' people will build a future for themselves on shared responsibility and shared accountability in covenant with God. Of course, God wants Moses to reach out in prayer when things get rough. But God wants to make sure that Moses doesn't do only that. The Israelites have to go forward. They have to take their own steps too. There's a discussion among the rabbis in the Talmud when they're debating about the existence of miracles in the world. And they're going back and forth disputing about whether or not God suspends the laws of nature to benefit people who faithfully believe in and pray to God. They go back and forth after quite a bit of time, and eventually they arrive at a conclusion. Yes, there are such things as miracles, and God does intervene in the affairs of the world when circumstances demand. But, they say, you shouldn't count on it. It is such a Jewish discussion, the recognition at once that things go wrong, that things aren't always the way we wish they could be, and the articulation that faith and religion and tradition are things that can help us cope with the brokenness of the world, help us make sense of the situation when everything around us seems senseless. But that pronouncement comes at the same time as the insistence that our religious belief can't be the thing that lets us off the hook for doing personally ourselves the work of repairing what's broken. To be Jewish has to include a commitment to personal initiative, a commitment to personal involvement in the world, and to resisting the tempting idea that we can sit back and fold our arms and wait for God to do the work of redeeming us. And so in that spirit, I want to take a moment now to touch on a topic that is important to me, which coincides with something happening on our calendar and in our community. This is the time of the year, the time really of every 5 years cycle, that the world Jewish community takes time to hold elections for the World Zionist Congress. You'll see a brief blurb about it on the back of your Shabbat handout on the way in. And I mentioned it in my bulletin article this month that went to all the members of our congregation. So I just want to take one moment to emphasize what these elections are, what they do, and what they mean. The World Zionist Congress is a collection of 500 delegates from all over the world representing the global Jewish community. And this is a delegation that meets in Jerusalem every 5 years. So this being a year divisible by 5, it's time for us to be holding elections for those delegates once again. The delegates of the World Zionist Congress are given some leverage over the national organizations inside Israel that shape Israeli society and that help guide the global Jewish agenda and, maybe most importantly, which allocate financial and other resources to various organizations in Israel, including our own reform movement. The delegates will, after elections be assembled in October for the first time, and the elections are open now and are being held through March the 11th. So who can vote in these World Zionist Congress elections? Everyone who's over the age of 18, who is Jewish, and who won't be voting in the Israeli Knesset elections. That's most of us. There is, I will tell you, a very small administrative fee to place your vote of $7.50. If you're between 18 and 25, it's only $5 to cover the cost of the elections and is not a donation to charity. I want to assure you, in the wake of the Iowa caucuses, that this is a secure and reliable election. There is no need to worry about fraud or international hackers trying to steal your vote. When you register to vote, which will be verified through the use of text messages sent to your cell phone, you'll have the opportunity to place your vote for one of the slates that are up for delegations this year. I want to encourage you to consider voting for the second slate in the order, which is titled Vote Reform. That's an easy way to help remember it. That reform slate is large and powerful, and it's big enough to allow us to help have significant influence over policy and change in support of progressive Judaism in Israel, and to help promote the kind of Israeli society that supports our values of pluralism and religious justice. Just to give you a sense of where we are in the current World Zionist Congress delegation, out of those 500 delegates, 145 of them are from American Jewish communities, which is the largest single group from the diaspora. And thanks to the votes that we got 5 years ago, about 39% of those American delegates represent the reform movement, which is really good news. It means that we've been able to ensure that over $20 million has been allocated to the Israeli reform movement over the past 5 years. This is a marvelous accomplishment and is very important, and we must make sure that we maintain those influences and those gains. So I am asking you, now, well, not now, after services, after Shabbat if you like, but certainly before March arrives, to take 3 minutes to place your vote to promote our movement and support religious pluralism in Israel. I want to emphasize that the World Zionist Congress delegates do not focus on matters of national security or diplomacy, but on issues of national religious identity and religious practice, the areas that are especially important to us, such as whose conversions are recognized for Jews abroad when they go to Israel, who is qualified to officiate at weddings and divorces in Israel, what rabbis are able to bury Jews in Israel, what kinds of rabbis are recognized in Israel, and so on. Our movement will stand to gain significant support from the votes that we place in favor of our slate at the World Zionist Congress. So I want to urge you to please take a few moments to place your vote before March arrives. So back to the Red Sea. What happens at the shore is a moment of realization for God and for Moses at the same time. When the freed slaves make their way to the edge of the water, Moses has to realize that God is capable of working miracles in the world, or he won't take the next step forward. And at the same time, God has to know that Moses will play a part in the Israelites' future too. Everything that we do must be a combination of our work and of God's, both receiving and appreciating the things that God has done and made for us, but also taking the time to plant seeds and make preparations for the future, to take our own human initiative, to prepare for the world and the community and the years that will follow us. God's response to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me?" is followed by a most important coda. Tell the Israelites to go forward. They had to go forward, and we do too. I urge you to take your part in leading us into the next steps forward. Shabbat Shalom.